Okay. Okay, so let's begin. When I first wrote the title of the world's richest country, What Makes Wealth, I was imagining the question would probably be as easy as the expected answer you want from me, which is the United States, right? Because our minds are wired, we think of what's the richest country, we look towards the benchmark metric of the world, which is GDP, and then we say, yeah, the United States is the richest based on GDP. But my goal throughout is to tell you guys that you could be surprised actually by using very other simple terms, indices, metrics, and whatnot. You can get drastically different ideas of what constitutes the richest country. This question is actually quite ambiguous. But before we look into this, I was still curious why the United States? And so I asked some of my friends, with the condition that they didn't mention GDP, why they think the United States is the richest country in the world. And the first guy he's doing the MSc Finance course with me in the United Kingdom. He told me this, look, no, people look beyond this concept, but actually, he believes it has to do with the US's leniency in bankruptcy laws. So he says it allows people to experiment, to learn, okay, without the fear of failing. It's almost as if the government of the US is actively promoting the absolute freedom for one to fail. Right? And he puts his theory into practice by telling me, look, where in the world do you have the highest clusters of unicorn startups in the world? It's in specific regions within the United States. Right? Comparative to any other country worldwide, the United States simply has the highest concentration of startup culture in the world. And he says that has very much to do with these fiscal approaches on bankruptcy laws. And then I asked another guy, he resides in New York and he is quite the patriotic man for the United States cause. And I said the same thing, why? And he actually asked me a question in return. He said, no, why does a realtor, what does a realtor look for the most to win a property? That's the question he asked me, if I remember correctly. And I knew the answer he wanted me to give him, which is location, location, location. That's what a real estate agent looks for the most. And he said, exactly. And it so much happens to be that the United States is a premium real estate because of its location, its geography, its environment, and its surroundings. And that took me a while to absorb this idea. But he told me this. Look, first of all, this country is very hospitable. What do I mean by this? It has a very large land mass, but it's not as populated as China or as India. First point. Secondly, it's also hospitable because you don't see these high concentrates of taiga forest as you see in Russia. Taiga forest is this boreal forest within the Arctic Circle. Right? I can attach a picture somewhere here. But Russia has these very dense regions of this forest that the United States simply does not have. The United States does not have a Gobi Desert like the ones you see in China. It doesn't have a low oxygen Himalayas range as China does. Okay? Simply put, the United States is actually very flat, it's very arable, and it's also very temperate. Okay, which leads to the second point he told me as well. This is a very well-connected real estate. Why? Externally, it's exposed to the Atlantic on one side, the Pacific on the other, and internally, the country is crisscrossed with rivers. And some of these rivers are deep water canals, which means it's commerce boosting as well. And externally, remember we said the United States is mostly temperate. Well, the maritime business is actually also flourishing because of that. The ports are operating year-round, okay? They're year-round productive. So there's no concerns of freezing like what you see in China or in Russia or in other competing nations as well. And so he said, look, he thanks the United States location for the strong fishing industry, the strong mining industry, oil as well. They're being less and less dependent on OPEC thanks to its geography, right? Steel production, silicon production. I see silicon. It doesn't have much to do with location. I'm just mentioning Silicon Valley for tech and IT as well. That obviously helps. I don't think it has much to do with location, but I could include it here. So it's truly a cornucopia of goods and services that the United States has, largely thanks to its geography. And that's a good answer he gave me. I thought that was really creative and interesting. I asked another few guys. One guy told me capitalism was the answer to my question. What makes the US the richest country? Capitalism. Capitalism. And I thought to myself, do you want to emphasize? No. Okay, I'll leave you there. Another guy told me taxes, though. That was quite a varying response. He said, look, in the United States, nothing is at its basic cost. Okay, you lose 10 to 40 cents for every dollar you make. In California, can you believe they're taking 40% taxes on high-skilled laborers within IT and tech? And I was thinking to myself, I told him this, look, man, you clearly haven't been to Europe yet, because we are quite intense when it comes to the tax game. And he said, exactly. But like it or not, look at Europe, look at the United States. Tax is a form of generative wealth. It makes the country rich. That's why Europe is wealthy. That's why the United States is wealthy. Look, I'm not here to counterfact these things. Another interesting perspective that was. So I'll include it in this answer. So I got all these varying responses, and I liked what I read. But now let's think for ourselves, and I want to base my answer, my perspective, on much simpler terms, right? And I want to show you guys how quickly we can change perspective. Okay? First, I told myself, how do I want to measure richness? What constitutes richness, statistically speaking, in terms of data? One could say, that's wealth. And when you're talking about wealth, you're measuring the net of current assets minus current liabilities, what you own versus what you owe. Sure, but you can also look at it through income, and then you're looking at a flow measure, right? Where you're measuring the rate of change of wealth over time. Or perhaps you want to aggregate these two into one metric, which is the conventional GDP already mentioned. That englobes both of them, kind of. It's the total output annually for a country, right? And in that case, yes, the United States is #1 richest based on GDP, and there's no competition. Okay, they're $10 trillion ahead of any secondary opponent, which would be China. Now, I could say, look, okay, that's all good. Can we adjust GDP for the standard of living of people? Can we adjust for the value of the money we have in each respective country? Currency does affect this. And a great way to adjust to that is by using the purchasing power parity metric, the PPP. And you can adjust GDP to PPP because the purchasing power parity metric, it measures the standardized basket of goods and services, which makes it easier or more valid to compare between countries. And in that case, the United States is no longer #1. China takes the helm for the richest country in terms of GDP adjusted for PPP. Okay? That's already an interesting inference to have. Then you can also say, okay, another standard inference you can make is by per capita, right? By head, by adult head. Okay, let's do GDP and divide it by its population, which is beneficial for countries that are relatively wealthy but have a low population gradient, right? And in that case, the United States is still highly ranked, but it's not near close #1 anymore, which makes sense. It's natural to be this way. But it's now surpassed by countries like Norway, like Qatar, which can kiss their ground dearly because they have this very rich energy and mineral deposits in their land, which greatly helps them achieve this achievement in this case. You have countries like Switzerland, like Ireland. They have a lot of capital flow, okay, passing through the country. Has much to do with their fiscal approach on things, right? Incentives and whatnot to corporations and to individuals. So if you're like me, you're in the UK and you're investing in an exchange-traded fund, most probable than not, you are vested in a company that's domiciled in Ireland. And so credit to Ireland, and it does push them quite up the table in terms of GDP per capita. And then you have Singapore. That's a superpower of trading entrepot you have there with Singapore, right? They trade globally, and that also helps them be high up the table. But is GDP per capita really an equitable measure to have? I mean, having oil to your disposal doesn't, it makes you rich, but does it make it rich in terms of a person individually? Because we're using GDP per capita kind of to measure richness at an individual scale. And I don't think it's fair. I don't think the money trickles down as obviously as it should. Unless, I don't have the ranking in front of me, but I'd assume countries like Denmark, for example, are probably also high on GDP per capita. And their case is truly because their economy is equitable. They have a high GDP per capita because they produce a lot, And it so much happens that this figure of GDP per capita is kind of proportionate to, if you look at the median income or the mean income of the population. And I could argue the same with the purchasing power parity metric. Don't assume that just because I mentioned GDP adjusted to PPP, that it's a better metric to be used. Not at all. I would actually say that the PPP is not a true quantity index because it suffers quite a lot by the systematic substitution biases. What do I mean by this? It assumes, or it's assumptive that people in markets behave efficiently. They make cost-effective decisions all the time, and that's not necessarily true. And I'm talking specifically about the aspect of the standardized basket of goods and services. No, not every good and service is internationally tradable. Countries impose tariffs. Many goods are non-tradable goods, simply put. So what I mean to say here overall is that, as you can see, there's no worldwide resonating metric that we can all agree on. Okay, now are there ways that I can change your opinion on what makes a country richest? Endless. It's perpetual. I'm not even kidding. I could stay here. I have in my notes in front of me 30 other metrics I could mention. And all of these metrics would generate a different ranking list of countries, and they could all be linked to an extent to the question being asked in the title. So, for example, an oversight people give normally is when you're measuring, for example, let's say mean or average income per capita, median income, or modal income. These are three common metrics that people use when they're creating statistics for the public. And I do believe that most people are unskilled or not accustomed to statistical interpretation, so they get biased really easily. The same set of data can prove very different things when analyzed by different people with different intentions. And I'll give a very practical and iterative example for you guys to understand this concept. Say that I have a society of 7 people. Okay, I have a society of 7 people. Let's say person A, B, and C, they're making 10K a year in income. Person, that would be D, is making 60K. Person E is making 65 or 70K, let's say 70K. And then the G of the society, person G, he's making 10 million euros, say. So, I kind of gave quite a feudalistic European society from the 1500s, but that's the society I have, society of 7 people. And I hire 3 different statisticians to help me understand how my society is going on. I hire the first guy comes in, and he's a statistician based on mean or the average income. And he comes to me and he shakes my hand, congratulations, man. You have a Monaco in your hands because the average person in your country is making 1.5 million euros annually. It's a wealthy bunch you have in front of you. And I'm over the moon. I'm really happy with this guy. I'm probably going to hire him again. He just boosted my ego tremendously. Now I hire the second guy. He's a statistician that's based on median incomes. And he comes to me, look, quite serene. I'm not disappointed at all. But I'm also not as impressed as your fellow over there that just came by. Because the median income in your society is 60K. It's not bad. It's not bad, but it's also not screaming good like the other guy was with you. I say, okay, thank you. I didn't like this guy as much as I liked the first one. The third statistician comes in my room and he is frenetical. He is going crazy with me. He tells me, you have almost a humanitarian cause in your hands. If this country was in Europe, for example, your standards are terrible because the modal income in your society lives below the poverty line, 10,000 euros a year. So with the same set of data that I presented to 3 professionals, my society was called Monegasque and extremely poor with the same information they got. And so you see what I'm saying here, how ambiguous and subjective information can be. And if you're just reading it with a sort of naked eye, you take very different conclusions than someone else. So if we are to actually classify the country in terms of average income, then number 1 is attributed to Switzerland, number 2 to the United States, and number 3 to Hong Kong. If we measure a country's wealth by median income, okay, check this, the United States drops 11 positions because now we're removing the tail end, the inequalities of the society with the median metric. And the United States drops to 13th place. Actually, number 1 is now Belgium, number 2 is Australia, and number 3, kudos to Hong Kong because they remain and retain the number 3 position for both mean and median incomes. But again, this is all to do with country data. What if we're interested in subnational wealth? That would be the case if you're like me and you're going to the UK. You're interested in working in London, not really anywhere else in the United Kingdom, right? Life in London is not life in the rest of the UK by any stretch of the imagination. Let's be frank here. And I have this quote by John Byrne Murdoch. He says the following: America is a rich country. Britain is a poor country with one wealthy region. London ranks fairly well, the rest of the country does not. And this is true, okay? The London, or better said, the United Kingdom is extremely London-centric, right? Without London, the UK would be poorer per capita as Mississippi in the United States. And I can show you this by checking this infographic from the Financial Times, which measures subnational GDP per capita, PPP adjusted at a log scale. Let's look at this. Germany's income powerhouse of Munich, it's not as force dependent to Germany as London is to the UK, if you see what I'm saying, right? The same with Amsterdam and Seattle in the United States too. So again, pause the video to make your own conclusions, but it will surprise you that the UK, without London, is as poor per head as Alkmaar in the Netherlands and Mississippi in the United States. And also that the US's average, without its richest region, just confirming, is better than any other city or region in the UK besides London by quite a lot as well. But still, for those laughing at the UK, right, I have bad news for you if you're French, if you're Spanish, if you're Italian as well, because I can extend that infographic to include your countries as well. And I'm not going to include Portugal, although there is Portugal as well in this list, because I don't want to embarrass myself and my fellow Portuguese people. But yeah, bear in mind, France is not doing any better either. And pause the video again, look at the data, you'll see that the UK, France, Italy, and Spain, the benchmark of the average if the richest region was removed is the same. The only difference is the levels of discrepancy. So France actually has a higher discrepancy than the UK. I'm complaining about the UK. I should be talking about France here. And now let's finish this episode off by asking another question, a final one, which is, if someone tells you this, my country is rich, why aren't I rich? That's a great question, and I got inspired that question from this guy called Rami Nakiza and his work. He was an investment banker, and his content is great, so check it out. It'll probably be in my description. Sure, but before we do mention that, let's refer back to a John Murdoch tweet. Okay, and let this next fact also sink in. Income inequality in the US and UK is so wide that while the richest are very well off, the poorest have a worse standard of living than the poorest in countries like Slovenia. So essentially, the US and UK are poor societies with some very rich people, okay? In a typical developed country, the top 10% versus low 10% discrepancy, you could call it, is about 3x, so 3 times. In the UK, that rises to 5 times. In the US, it's 6 times. And it would be advisable by Murdoch himself to go live in a more equity economy like France, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands as well, because if you're within the poorer brackets of society, because the standard of living there remains much higher than if you were in the UK or in the US. And well, I'll stop this video right about here. I think I've given you guys a few perspectives. We could keep talking for a lot more and get much more technical, but I'm doing this a bit through my own intuition as well, so I don't want to give you guys any misinformation. But thanks to Rami Nakiza as well as Murdoch for the insights they gave me, especially in the second half of this episode. Thank you all for tuning in. This was Nun going for the Academic Observer on Economics, Business, and Finance, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.